Welcome to the RAW Review. My name is Matthew.
And I'm Brileigh.
And we'll be your co-hosts for this series of conversations where we'll be sitting down with collectors, artists, and other members of the RAW DAO community.
Today we'll be talking with Shane Lavalette. Shane is a founding member of RAW DAO, the former director of nonprofit Lightwork, and one of the co-founders of Assembly, which is a gallery, agency, and creative studio supporting visual artists from around the world.
In this episode, we'll talk with Shane about how he got involved with NFTs, the story behind Assembly, and his collection One Sun, One Shadow, which was recently acquired by RAW DAO. Thank you so much, Shane, for joining us for this week's episode of the RAW Review. We're really grateful for your time, and we're looking forward to chatting.
So let's start at the very beginning. How did you get into photography? And what is it about making photos that pulled you in?
Oh, wow. Very beginning. Okay, let's see here. So, I grew up in Vermont, which was a great place to grow up. And I got very lucky. My high school had a black and white darkroom. It was a public school, but it just had this great darkroom. And I had a very enthusiastic teacher, Miss James. Shout out to Miss James, who got me excited about photography. It was probably the first time that I saw photography as something more than family photos and snapshots and their other uses in our life, and saw the potential for it as an artistic medium and a form of expression. So I spent a lot of time in that darkroom and just got very excited about making and looking at the world through photographs, and just kind of captivated by the magic of it, really, how photography forces you to look deeply at the world and engage with things and learn about the world and translates moments into something that can sometimes transcend or be surreal or take you elsewhere, somewhere beyond the world itself. And so, growing up there, I eventually came the moment where you kind of decide if you're, going to go off to college and study something. And what I was really passionate about was photography. So I applied and got into the museum school and Tufts, which is in Boston. And I went to SMFA to study photography, and that's where I think my study of the medium and history of photography really blossomed, and that's where I got really interested in publishing and working with other artists and, finding a community within the art photography world.
I connect to that too. In high school, I was also introduced to the darkroom and had a teacher that was really pushing me to go in that direction and really encouraged me. And that really led to me going to undergrad to study photography as well.
I guess I could go back further than that, technically. When I was really little, I grew up in a trailer park in Vermont, and I had these neighbors that would babysit me, and they gave me a Polaroid camera at the time. And that was probably my actually, first introduction to photography. I just photographed them hanging around the house, or pictures outside the trailer and kind of the yard there and things like that. But even though I was really, really young, probably, I think 5 years old, I think that still kind of got me hooked on the magic of looking at the world and making pictures.
That's really sweet and really funny as well, because I actually took my first footsteps at a trailer park that I grew up at.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Where is that? That's in Canada?
Yeah, it would have been in rural Ontario.
Oh, okay.
3 hours away from Toronto.
Oh, cool.
Were there any artists in particular that you took inspiration from while you were studying, or started to learn a lot more about photography through the history and whatnot?
That's so hard. I mean, certainly there's so many photographic greats. I was definitely influenced by a lot of early color photography, William Eggleston and Stephen Shore. I loved Nan Golden. Nan Golden spent some time actually at museum school. I think she dropped out. But I used to go to this bar in Boston called The Other Side just because I heard that she used to hang out there back in the day. When I was in school, the museum school is a very self-directed program. You actually don't have grades for studio classes for studying art. And instead, you kind of learn the process of critiquing and talking about each other's art. Every semester you put up work, and you are either the person being critiqued or you are in the position of talking about others' work. And because the program was very self-directed, I also found myself gravitating to the internet as a place to find community. And the photography community at the school was great, but it was also pretty small. And I wanted to understand what was going on around the world for photography. So I also found myself connecting with many photographers around the world whose work I admired. I started a photography blog at the time. This was maybe 2005 or so. maybe even a little bit earlier. But I started writing about photographers and books and work that I liked. So I was on a weekly basis, even sometimes on a daily basis, finding and researching and featuring photographers whose work I liked and was inspired by. So I think I was just as inspired by someone that I could have discovered back on Flickr at the time, or somewhere on the internet, or just discovered their website, a kind of emerging artist and photographer, sometimes as I was some of the photographic greats.
In 2009, you founded Layflat, which is an independent publishing house. Can you tell us a bit about where your interest in publishing started and a little bit about that side of your journey?
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, while I was in school, as I mentioned, I was spending a lot of time online, and I was blogging and kind of having this experience with photography that was pretty ephemeral, like the way in which blogs work. Of course, you feature things and then they kind of disappear. And my interest in photography books probably goes back to growing up in Vermont as well. It's a state that doesn't have, it's not like an art capital, and there's not a lot of museums or institutions or galleries to discover fine art photography. And so even in that photo class, like the library at my high school, or when I could save up and buy a photography book from a bookstore in the area, it was really photography books that taught me about photography and transported me. So it was kind of this combination of this passion that I developed for looking at and learning about photography books when I was in high school, along with just that feeling of blogging and kind of engaging with photography online as being fleeting and wanting to produce some projects that felt like they could be lasting. And, I do see the photo book as actually one of the ideal forms for photography to live in. Photography is a great medium because it can be exhibitions, and it can be books, and it can be NFTs, and it can be a website, it can be an immersive slideshow installation, it can be all these things. But what I love about books is that they're relatively affordable, and photography reproduces really well in book form. Printing quality can be nice, and they're these kind of contained, intimate experiences that you can return to. And I was looking at so many other photographers' work who I was inspired by and wanted to work with other artists and support other artists and find ways to make projects. So, I got, I think, a small grant from the school at the time, and that helped kickstart my publishing venture. And I started with a magazine that brought together various artists, and then I, from there, kind of jumped into working on a few different artist books with photographers. And what I liked about those, or artist books in general, is just that they're these intentional objects where you can obsess over every detail of the book, the scale, the materiality, number of pages, like how the works are printed,
right,
all these kinds of things. And I think that passion for photo books really blossomed then, and it definitely continues. I became a bit of a photo book collector and lover.
Do you see the photo book as the sort of final medium for your works versus works that are wall-based? I've heard some photographers describe themselves as book photographers or, wall photographers. Do you have this feeling that maybe the photo book is the best medium for a lot of the images and projects that you work on?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I love physical exhibitions. I love physical art experiences. But, growing up, galleries aren't always the type of spaces that feel welcoming or feel like you can really spend time in them. When I experience a gallery in its ideal form, I'm probably like the only person in it or something, right? And you feel like you're in sort of a dream space. And actually, that's what's kind of interesting about some of these virtual spaces. You sort of have that feeling. But I recognize that books accomplish all of these other things that I love. Like, they are intimate objects. You can return to them. Usually exhibitions just have a period of time that they run for. And so books kind of change with time. They also can travel, right? When I started publishing books, I experienced the positive effects of that. And when someone would order a book, and the magazine, for example, that I talked about, I think we printed somewhere around 1,000 copies or 1,500 copies. I can't remember, but it sold out within a few months. And every single one of those copies I packed by hand and put in an envelope and took to a post office. And
wow.
So all these books traveled all over the world. And then you also see the way in which they exchange hands or become gifts or end up in a bookshop. And, someone writes you from Sweden or wherever you can think of and says, oh, hey, I saw this in the bookshop. It was great to discover. So I saw that as being a really positive thing about books too. It was sort of its own community within the photo community. And then it had this really special way of traveling.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you bring up community as a way of traveling. And it's true that the book is a lot more accessible than an exhibition, which is temporary, but also the feeling of being in those spaces can not always be welcoming for everyone.
Yeah, I think with an exhibition, of course, you can play with installation, you can play with creating a more physically immersive experience. You have scale to work with, but, you still with photography, think about a lot of the same things. Where does this work begin on the wall and where does it end? And, how does a viewer move through the space? So books are kind of like that too. They're spaces to move through.
Let's talk about Lightwork. For those who aren't familiar, can you tell us what is Lightwork and how you got involved?
Yeah, sure. Lightwork is an incredible nonprofit organization that was started in the early 70s, 1973. So it's almost 50 years old now. In 2010, I worked on a commission for the High Museum of Art that later became this project, One Sun, One Shadow, that we'll talk about. And when I made the photographs, I came back and over the course of actually 2 different summers, I photographed, and I had probably 500 negatives that I needed to scan and process and work through for the sake of making prints for this exhibition for the museum. So I was seeking some sort of residency or opportunity that would allow me to do that. And I'd heard about Lightwork because a number of friends who are photographers had done a residency there. And so on a whim, I applied and was lucky enough to get accepted as an artist. And I think it was August of 2011 that I did a residency there. And it was right around the same time that the previous associate director had left her role. So as I was finishing up the residency, I applied for the job. I was already kind of looking for an opportunity to get involved with an organization or a museum or a gallery space so that I could have that balance of, working with and supporting other artists and, having an opportunity to maintain my own work. And what I loved about Lightwork was it brought together a lot of my interests. It was, exhibition space. There's a number of exhibitions that happen each year. There was the residency program, of course, a grants program. There was a community lab facility, which was just a space that was open to the public for folks to come through and print and scan and, studio, really everything you could think of. And the opportunity to get involved with an organization that brought together a lot of incredible artists and programs and connecting points was really exciting to me. So I was lucky enough to get that role. And so I moved from Boston to Syracuse to work as the associate director. And then maybe 2 years in, the director left, I think in part for another opportunity. And I slid into that role. And when I came there, I probably thought, oh, this might be a few years or something like that. And I ended up being there for a decade, for 10 years, and finding myself more and more in a leadership role and curating, doing all the fundraising for the organization, really everything that goes into running the nonprofit. But it did exactly what I was hoping for, right? It was the space where I was plugged into a really amazing local and national and international community. And then I, had this great opportunity to support a lot of artists. I think I worked with probably a little over 100 artists in residence that came through. I probably curated over 50 exhibitions. I think published about 70 books that I was involved in. So there was a lot that happened in those 10 years, and it was really great.
Thank you for going through that summary of how you got involved with Lightwork. It's kind of an incredible story of being there at the right place at the right time and how that's allowed you to find yourself in a leadership role. And I'm interested to know if you could talk about what has that experience taught you, given that you spent over a decade there?
Well, it taught me a lot of things. I think I learned a lot of just sort of logistical things about running a business and operating a space and cultivating a sense of community. But one thing that I think I really loved about Lightwork is its mission, which was to support emerging and underrepresented artists working in photography. And So through identifying and kind of championing that mission, I think I learned a lot about, and from being an artist myself, of course, I learned a lot about how hard it is to be an artist. It's a very difficult job emotionally, financially, logistically, everything. And so having spaces and individuals that are involved in such spaces that are there to support you and align with you and be a platform to amplify your work is extremely important. I mean, with the residency program, folks had an opportunity to spend time in Syracuse and work through a project and get a small stipend to, I think it was a $5,000 stipend, so actually not small, a good sized stipend to support their work and practice. And that showed me that there's no shortage of artists that need time, space, and support to realize their projects and work. I think we would get well over 1,000 applications for 12 slots for that program every year. So it was really a lot to go through. And the breadth of the work and artists all over the world, I think it showed me that there was a desire and need for these sort of support systems, whether it's exhibitions or residencies, et cetera.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about how many submissions that you received for Lightwork. I wonder if you think that the traditional art world is more or less competitive than the NFT space. I definitely know that there's a lot of competition for NFT artists to, sell their work and get opportunities as well. I wonder if you've thought about that at all, how these two spaces might be similar or different in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see them necessarily as separate spaces, actually, right? Like we're in the art world and there's artists and creators, and photography, I guess, is a very expansive medium. So there's a lot of different kinds of photography and different fields or communities within photography. But within every field, I think you see some level of competition or just a lot of people that are vying for the same kinds of opportunities. And within the Web3 space, I've definitely seen a lot of the positivity that feels very much as though individuals are lifting each other up and, building together and seeking these opportunities for cross-pollination and collaboration and things like this. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think there's still sometimes a smaller group of people that get the most success and a lot of people that are kind of struggling to figure out their path towards finding that success. But that all depends on how you define success, of course, too.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you discovered NFTs? How did this all begin for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, NFTs have been on my radar for maybe almost 2 years or so. I got interested in crypto a little more seriously in 2017, and I was intrigued by NFTs, but it probably wasn't until around March of last year that I thought very seriously about what that could mean for photography or for visual art in general. It was around that time that me and my now business partner, Ashlyn Davis Burns, who was the former executive director and curator at the Houston Center for Photography in Houston, Texas. After the pandemic hit, we kind of put our heads together and decided to take a leap and create a platform to support artists, a hybrid platform that kind of brought together elements of a gallery, an agency, creative studio, and sort of reimagined what artist representation looked like. And so, we started Assembly as an online venture at first that, didn't have a physical space and was about cultivating opportunities for the artists that we worked with and represent. And a few artists that we represented were really interested in NFTs as well. So beyond my own interest, Alejandro Cartagena was one of them, Rodrigo Valenzuela, Christina Velasquez, Daniel Gordon, who was not on our roster, but we were speaking with. We're all excited about, the potential of this medium for a new outlet, just like books, just like exhibitions. This is a new way to introduce your work to the world, a new way for it to travel and be experienced and understood, and then, of course, collected. So this idea of digital ownership is something that's intrigued me for a long time. And I'm a deep, deep appreciator of physical objects and prints and books and all of these things. And yet I also recognize that digital experiences and memories and objects or assets, rather, like things that we might want to collect digitally, if anything, it's going to continue to be a bigger part of our lives as we live more and more digitally rather than move the opposite direction. So, I think for myself and for the artists we work with, I really wanted to figure out, we know a lot of the best practices about how you introduce your work and how you print your work and how you edition it and how you sell it within a traditional art market. But what are the best practices and what should artists be doing and thinking about when it comes to minting and putting out their work within the NFT space? We really didn't know all the answers to these questions. Maybe we still don't know a lot of the answers to these questions, but that pursuit, I think, began with an interest in figuring that out. And of course, being very excited about the royalty potential for artists with NFTs. The idea that in the physical art market, when a work goes to auction or is resold by a collector, of course, it's nearly impossible to enforce that kind of kickback to support the artist. So that in itself was also just an exciting element of it as we moved into investigating NFTs further and as I moved into thinking about it for myself and my own work too.
Where does the name Assembly come from?
Oh, good question. I think we tossed around a lot of different names before we landed on it, but for us, it kind of meant a lot of things. It meant a bringing together of these different facets and ways of working as an artist. So because it combines elements of a gallery and an agency where we work with traditional collectors and museums and institutions to place works in collections. And the agency side is working with magazines and brands to produce creative storytelling projects and campaigns. And we were working on consulting projects with publishers and book projects. And we're helping artists actually apply for grants to fund their work. So Assembly certainly evokes this idea of bringing together all these different facets and ways of working, which actually illustrates what it is to live an artistic life, because rarely do artists just sell prints. You kind of like piece together this myriad of ways of working in order to survive. But Assembly also means to us, it kind of evokes this collective quality of the group of artists that we work with. It's everyone kind of coming together, and there is kind of a communal aspect to that, which I think expands out into the ways that we've seen the possibilities for what growing a digital and or physical community can mean beyond just us or the artists.
Is one of the goals of Assembly to onboard traditional artists into this new space? Do you see that as one of the roles that Assembly might play? And how do you feel about Assembly being positioned sort of one foot in the traditional art world and the other in this emerging space? How do you see these two things working together?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially last year when we started, if you were to make a Venn diagram of the traditional art world or market and crossover with the NFT space, it would be barely crossing over. But I think we recognize that crossover will be more and more with time, and as the space matures and as things change. And I think there's kind of value in the ways that the NFT space operates entirely outside of that or antithesis to that. A lot of the systems or expectations about how the traditional art market works are not good. It's very broken in a lot of ways. And that's a big part of why we started Assembly and come from a nonprofit background, a more artist-centric background. And I'm an artist myself. So I think there's ways in which the traditional art world needs to be more artist-centric and be more equitable for artists and has all kinds of issues that it needs to reconcile. And what's exciting about Web3 is there is that opportunity to project and create its own kind of history and ways of working. And yet, I think there's this exciting position that we're in as two individuals who have worked in the art world for a while. And, our colleagues are curators at museums and institutions. And we've worked with lots of accomplished artists, whether they're iconic or mid-career or emerging, to help educate and bridge those two worlds if you want to look at them as separate. And for someone who might be a traditional physical art collector who's curious about digital assets and curious about collecting NFTs, we can talk to them about how to do it and why there's value in that. And vice versa. I think there's been a really nice opportunity to almost work in an art advisory role, sometimes with some collectors that I've connected with personally who are building amazing NFT collections and are becoming more and more excited about what they can do with a physical art collection and might be new to art or new to photography and want someone with expertise in the field to help navigate that direction too. So I think there's an exciting bridging of the digital and physical, and where we can cultivate that crossover, I think it's just a really positive thing.
Definitely. What are some of the challenges that come with working in both those contexts of the traditional and the digital space in Assembly?
Some of the challenges, well, the space is developing so fast, and the NFT landscape that it's sometimes hard to keep up with, right? And I sort of mentioned best practices. And back when we launched, there wasn't Manifold, there wasn't Chip, there weren't these kind of easier ways of deploying your own smart contract, or, just the way that the technology operates is evolving so quickly that it can be difficult to keep up with. So that's a responsibility of ours when we're helping artists into the space or working with collaborators or partners. That's something we want to be kind of on top of. And I think the traditional art world and art market kind of works at a different pace and has kind of different maybe rules or expectations about how things are done. So it can be difficult, I think, to bounce back and forth between those worlds because they have different languages and expectations and things like that. But, that's, I think, a challenge that we really like, and I think I really enjoy, just because I like parts about both of those worlds.
Have you approached artists from the traditional art world to start making NFTs and faced apprehension or refusal? I think one of the challenges in onboarding new people to the space is the role that media plays in the public perception of NFTs and crypto more generally. And it's sort of a struggle because sometimes people hate NFTs, but they don't know why they hate them. And it's sort of a lot to explain to someone to go through how all of this works. And there's so much new terminology. And like you said, the tech is really moving at such a fast pace. And even now, a lot of things are kind of janky, to say the least. What has your experience been like working with artists from a more traditional background and bringing them over to this side?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some folks that just aren't going to be interested in, being a part of a plane that's being built while it's flying, right? And then there are folks that are exactly interested because of that. Like, there's so much room for innovation and reimagining that can happen. So I've definitely experienced a broad spectrum of responses, right? From, I don't know, someone responding to an email with a poop emoji to someone just being really excited and is sort of intrigued to learn more. And I think it's definitely unfortunate when, whether it's politics or any topic, when someone kind of reduces it to being so black and white and is not willing to kind of go deeper or learn and experience. And there's some people that, like you said, that will just make up their mind based on one specific thing or one news article or whatever it is, and kind of discount a whole development. And then there's other people that I think are a bit more open-minded. And definitely in talking with artists, I think a lot of artists are just curious, right? And, that's something that I always advise when I talk to artists. We definitely watch a rush happen of a lot of artists kind of flocking to NFTs and kind of rushing to mint their work and maybe feeling like they missed out on something or were already too late or something like that. And I think when I talk to artists, I try to express the opposite, that it's still very early in this developing technology, and that it's actually very important to give yourself months to learn about technology, learn about blockchain, learn about the different platforms for releasing or minting your work, learn about position yourself in relation to it and decide, does this make sense for my work? And then to think about it in terms of the work as well, just like you would with an exhibition or a book. Does this make sense as an exhibition? Does it make sense as an immersive website? Does it make sense as a video piece that's projected in a space?
Right.
Does it make sense as a photography book? Does it make sense as NFTs? And so I think if artists kind of slow down and give themselves that time, they will figure out not only how is best to introduce their work, but hopefully kind of land on the work that can make sense for the space and can make sense for their own practice and interests and ideas as artists.
Yeah, it's always good to emphasize that no one is too late and that we're only just getting started now.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of emphasis on sales for NFTs, of course, which is an exciting and important part of the space. The economics of it are really, really important. And yet, I think there's a lot of other reasons why the technology is important, and artists can think about it as a form of archive and can think of it as a space to play in conceptually with work, and to think about how technology can be used in ways that actually speaks to and with and is a part of the artwork itself. So, I just think there's so many different reasons why artists should position themselves and participate in emerging technology. And photography is a medium that is intrinsically linked to technology, right? It's always evolved. And, you see, I think, similar confusion or skepticism, or the photography world sometimes just doesn't do well with change and new developments. I think when when digital photography came out, there were people that deemed it not photography. And those same people probably don't even think about it at all now, right? Many of them anyway. So I think that it's funny to kind of see that play out in similar ways with NFTs, where it's just an emerging technology that people don't understand how it can be an important extension of this medium that is inherently technological.
It's funny, we actually discovered that while running your publishing house, Layflat, that you released a photo book called Dune by RAW DAO member Misha de Ritter.
Yeah.
Do you have many friends in Web3 that you have worked with previously in the traditional art world? This reminds me of how I discovered that Claudia Pollack, who I went to university with at Ryerson, was involved with Web3, and we sort of rediscovered our friendship once we both realized that we were working in this space.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of individuals from either exhibitions I curated or books that I worked on, or just friends and people that I knew in the photo world that I've brought into Web3 or, gotten curious about Web3. But there's also been a few kind of interesting chance encounters. And Misha's a great example. I don't remember actually what year that was. Maybe 2010, we published his book Dune together. And it was this beautiful little artist book exploring the landscape, the Dutch countryside outside of Amsterdam. And I've always loved Misha's work and kind of sensitivity to color and photography. And I can't even remember where we bumped into each other, but it was either Twitter or maybe the Assembly Discord back when it started. I think we launched that in last summer, and it was the only art photography Discord server at the time. So we started seeing some people pop in and conversing with each other who, in some cases, we might recognize. Robin Friend is actually another of those artists. Robin and I exhibited our work together at the Musée de l'Élysée in Lausanne, Switzerland. We and I think 80 photographers were, or close to 80, were flown to Switzerland in 2010 to be a part of this crazy project called Regeneration that was showcasing emerging artists from around the world. And we both had work on that show, and I think we connected, enjoyed each other's work and each other as human beings. And we kind of loosely kept in touch, but it was actually in this Web3 space that we reconnected and started talking a lot again about photography. And then both were learning about generative art and PFPs and looking at other stuff and talking about other things together. So it is cool to see those things come full circle or collide. There's now a lot of artists that I know personally as friends or colleagues, or artists that I've worked with or supported in the past who've come into the NFT space, and it's great to see familiar faces.
Can you tell us a bit about how you got involved with RAW DAO?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a founding member of RAW DAO. So Luis and a number of other folks that were involved in some of the early conversations about RAW when it was just kind of a bubbling idea. We knew it was just a matter of time before a DAO could emerge that would be focused on photography. And when it did, I knew, I want to be a part of this. I want to kind of see how I can contribute and what ways something like a photography DAO could support and impact this ecosystem that I've gotten very passionate about. And so I just kind of stayed involved in those conversations. And so as it all developed and emerged, of course, I was there for those conversations to see how I could support the programs and support the ideas. And it's tough in Web3 because there's so many interesting projects to get involved in, and there's so many things that you can kind of say yes to. And at the end of the day, you have to kind of figure out what's my capacity with all this. And so I could probably get involved in RAW in a way that would just be a full-time job, and that would be an interesting thing to do. But now I think I'm involved in a little bit more of a passive way, although hopefully as a helpful community member. And, I have a lot of ideas of what a DAO can do, especially a collecting DAO like RAW can do within a space that doesn't have institutions, it doesn't have museums or these other kind of forms of validation that you might have in the traditional art world or art market. And so, I'm excited about RAW because of that, because it can be this collection that kind of charts this, both the history of photography that already exists and the great artists that are kind of coming into Web3, but also this kind of new and emerging history that's happening within Web3 of artists that might not previously have experience exhibiting or publishing and are kind of finding and building an audience and meaning and engagement around their work pretty much purely in the NFT space. But then, of course, it can extend out into all the other parts of the art world in ways that photography proliferates. I'm just excited about what RAW can be for the NFT photography space now as I was when it started. And it's accomplished a lot over the course of time that it's been running. And I'm curious to see where it'll go from here.
Right. Is RAW your first DAO? And have you gotten involved with any other DAOs?
Yeah, I think kind of in parallel or around the same time, I was involved in conversations with a DAO called Untitled. Untitled DAO is a much smaller group of individuals that kind of came together and, rather than kind of doing a big raise for a treasury, it was just a matter of pooling funds and starting to build a kind of much smaller, more agile collection that focused actually on diversity and emerging voices. And I think was really just an opportunity to have a little bit more focus and agility as a DAO in contrast to some of the ways that RAW might work with 200 members or more, right, as opposed to 20 or so members, for example. With every DAO, I think there's challenges, whether it's the differing opinions or ideas or people's time and ability to contribute. But I think both of them, I've seen some really positive things happen. And beyond the collecting activities or the sort of permanent collection that RAW might be building or semi-permanent collection, they're just another space, I think, for individuals to learn from each other and make connections. And hopefully out of those will be friendships or collaborations or opportunities to work together.
Briefly summarized, RAW DAO's mission is to signal value in the NFT photography market and build the most important collection of works through a decentralized community curation process. What are your thoughts on this community-based approach to curation, and why do you think this collection will be important going forward?
Oh, great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to go about curating. And I think sometimes the word curating is actually misused, right?
Absolutely.
At least to me, curating isn't selecting, right? It's not just picking. Curating is also not actually a group of people voting. But when I think about curating, I think about it kind of in an institutional context. It means building proper context and meaning and education and value around the work. And so whatever route RAW takes towards curating, whether it's a small curatorial committee or a kind of open, I guess you could say more decentralized voting process, I think there's going to be flaws in every approach to building a collection or quote unquote curating. But, I think what's great about the current approach is that anyone who's a member can nominate work and can vote on work. And I think if I were thinking about what could make sense for the process and how it could be better, I do think that there is value in having some folks that have curatorial expertise and experience, as well as collectors who have demonstrated experience financially, making some of the decisions around, say, the number of works to collect or how deep to collect with an artist or when to buy and how to buy, and some of the things that might be important to RAW and its mission or other parts of its mission. But what I think is really great about the community involvement is that it casts a really wide net and it has a broad range of kinds of work that might not be brought to the table unless you do an immaculate job of making sure that your curatorial committee is extremely diverse and representative of the membership. Mm-hmm. With every process, there's always going to be kind of challenges or flaws. But I think what's exciting about the community curation is it's something I haven't really seen done before. I mean, I don't know if I would call it curating. I think it is a misnomer there. But I think that it's exciting to see how that process of collecting, that process of selecting and buying work can lead to different types of results.
Right. Your collection, One Sun, One Shadow, was just chosen by RAW DAO for the latest round of community curation.
Yeah, it was.
And this work is an extension of the images that you made for the commission for the High Museum's Picturing the South exhibition in 2012. And for listeners who might not be familiar, can you describe the types of images in the series and some of the themes that you were addressing in it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was absolutely honored to have the opportunity to work on that project. I was I think 23 or 24 at the time. I was really young and relatively recently out of school. And the High Museum had previously commissioned Dawood Bey and Sally Mann and Alex Soth and Richard Mizrak, and the list goes on. It was a lot of photographers that I had learned about or idolized or admired in different capacities. And they asked me if I would do this project as part of Picturing the South, which had a pretty open constraint in terms of what it could be. It truly just had to be in the American South. And I grew up in the Northeast. I spent my whole life in Vermont and in Boston, kind of jumping around in New York. And the South was part of the country that I didn't know well. And so I thought a lot about how, as an outsider, I can make a project that kind of feels true to me and true to my experience. And, I was developing my work at the time, and I was developing my understanding of what it means to kind of respond to the world photographically. And in thinking about the American South, it was actually photography itself probably informed a lot about my ideas of what the American South is, but also film and music. And I was really surprised, just because of the South's rich musical history, that there hadn't been another artist photographer that did something connected to music. And photography is a weird medium, I think, to choose to do something related to music, because it's silent, and yet it also is a really interesting one for that reason. And so I didn't want to do a traditional documentary that, maybe visited various blues musicians or something like that. I was very interested in how I could create a more lyrical and a more poetic project that kind of responded to the ways in which landscape inform song and vice versa, like how, blues and old time and gospel and traditional songs, which many of which are kind of oral histories in and of themselves, are evocative of place. And so to work on the project, I developed a bit of an itinerary for myself, and it was kind of research based at first, but photographically it was very much designed around the idea of saying yes to things and kind of being open to seeing what sort of chance encounters could happen. So I spent time in places like Memphis, Tennessee, or Clarksdale, Mississippi. But as I was traveling around, I was traveling all over for months, actually, that first summer, and kind of living out of my car. You meet people and you talk to someone, they say, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so, or you've got to go to this place. And if you just say yes, you kind of end up in interesting situations. And then some of the photographs are kind of playful visual studies that respond to the way the light is or the way the weather is, like the musicality of everyday life.
I've heard your work or the images that you make described as quiet. That's come up in a few interviews. And the piece that RAW DAO just acquired, which is number 28, it's a young woman on a swing, like a tire swing, sort of looking back at the camera. Can you tell us a little bit about this image and maybe the story behind it?
Yeah, sure. No, it is interesting. Like I said, I think it was Tim Davis, whose work I really love. He wrote something that said that they're quiet pictures that build to a boisterous whole, which I kind of liked. And, I do think about with photography. I think that's why I like books. I like the ways in which photographs inform each other or speak to one another. That's just something I love about the medium, that it can be narrative and you can kind of form these connections in the space between the pictures, especially with a project that is kind of travel-based or is about moving through the world in a way. When I would install this work in a physical space, it's often playfully hung kind of up and down the walls, which evokes, of course, musical notes, but it also kind of prompts, I think, the viewer to get closer to some pieces and farther from others and, literally kind of move up and down the wall. But yeah, the picture that you described, I believe that was made in Louisiana. I just met this family in passing when I was photographing around there. I think it was near Springfield, if I remember correctly. And it was just a scene that caught my eye. There was a kind of smoldering fire in their yard in the background.
Right.
And this girl was just kind of swinging in front of it. And, there's something about the American South that attracted me and is, of course, a part of, mystery that kind of plays out in books and other kind of mythology around the American South. It's a landscape that is both treacherous and beautiful and has these dualities to it that I think I really love. And so yeah, with that picture, it's both kind of like a playful and fun and lighthearted young child on a swing, and yet at the same time there's this maybe darker or more sinister implication that comes through in the image. And that's something that I think, coming from the Northeast, you can even feel in being out in the woods in the South, or being in the swamps. There are truly more treacherous animals or, the storms or whatever it is about kind of the environment that feels like there's something lingering under the surface. And the same is true for the history of the American South, which is complicated and difficult. It's an important part of America, and yet it has a really fraught and difficult history to contend with.
Yeah, I like thinking about these images as both being really mundane and, as previously described, kind of quiet or contemplative, but also having a sort of tension to them. I mean, partly because of the context of the place that you alluded to, but also there can sometimes be an unexpected element in the image. Another image that I really like from this series is number 23, which is an image of an old pair of binoculars on a table with some cherry tomatoes, and reminds me a little bit of a Stephen Shore image of a puzzle laid out on a table, where it's so unbelievably mundane that it almost questions, why it needs to be a photograph. But there's something about the light and the color and the way that it renders as a photograph that makes it sort of transcend that moment. And it sort of feels like that old quote that says that photography, sometimes you're taking photographs to see what they would look like as photographs, if that makes sense. You're trying to see what the scene would look like rendered as a photograph. And that's actually, to some extent, what the work is about. Can you tell us a little bit about that image?
Absolutely. It's funny you say that, because that kind of goes back to my original love of photography, right? It's the way that it renders the world, or when you have a moment frozen in time, it's something that's fleeting. And I'm sure that obviously that scene is gone now, but with a photograph, you have the ability, and even when you're photographing, you kind of have that experience of looking deeply at the world. And so you might notice details or see something familiar in a way that is unfamiliar. And I love that too. I mean, I think that's an image that's weirdly simple and complex at the same time. It was when I'm making pictures, I might have subjects in mind or things I want to photograph, but I'm trying to be open to the things that are kind of in my peripheral vision or I might overlook in a place. And that's actually a picture I made. I think it was on the back porch of the mother's house of someone that I photographed in another image that's in the project. And, I could have easily walked past it or not really noticed it too much, but it's one that I love for a number of reasons. It just has that kind of mystery and quality about it that makes you ask questions or be curious or appreciate some of those details. I can't remember if it's Blockbird or Pixel Pete. One of them collected that one as an NFT.
I believe that is Blockbird. So there you go.
Yeah, Blockbird. He mentioned the same thing to me. I think that was what drew him to the piece, was just that kind of strange beauty and the everyday or the familiar.
It's interesting to think about your background in the Northeast of the United States, making this work about the South, and now recently moving to live in the South. And I'm interested to know, what was your relationship to the South when you were making the images in One Sun, One Shadow? And how has this relationship changed over time? Do you feel differently about this body of work today?
Yeah, it's a great question. The project was actually exhibited again at the High Museum this last year, and it was, I think, marking the 25th anniversary of their commissioning series that they were doing, and it was about 10 years from the time that I was working on the project. So I was thinking a lot about that, and certainly I feel like I know the South a bit more. I mean, I'm from America, I'm from the US, and the US is a really complicated country that has a complex social fabric, and in some ways parts of the country, like the American South, are their own country. Things that you might expect, or maybe stereotypes you have about different regions or people, some of which are kind of hold true and many of which are just kind of inflated. But I certainly felt like I was able to connect with and fall in love with a region and understand it as a part of the country that I'm from, even if I will never have a relationship to the American South like someone who's grown up here. But I would hope that someone from the South can see and experience and understand parts of, the Northeast in the same way. And yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, I've, very recently relocated to Houston. So I'm kind of repositioning myself and, everything that goes along with that. It's interesting just to have a new perspective on things and have a new place to at least call home for now. Mm-hmm. Back then I probably didn't see myself moving to, say, Texas, but to me, it's a really exciting place to be right now. And Houston in particular, I mean, it's one of the most diverse major cities, if not the most diverse metropolitan cities in the country. Amazing art, amazing food, music, sort of everything that goes along with the cultural things we want to consume and experience in the place that we might live. I'm really enjoying that.
One of the things that we talked about in our last episode with Justin Aversano was the importance of building community, particularly in the NFT space. And now you're working on Assembly, but you're also involved, obviously, in the kind of broader NFT photography community. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how Assembly will contribute to this? How will Assembly build community in the NFT space, but also in the traditional art world? Do you feel like this is something that is maybe missing from the traditional art world, like this focus on building community? And maybe you could touch a little bit on the new physical space that Assembly is working on as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think so, because I actually see a lot of parallels between, say, for example, the nonprofit that I worked for, right? These were artist-run community spaces that popped up in the 1970s, and they were often kind of in rejection to the bigger institutions or the museums that weren't showing a lot of women and weren't showing a lot of artists of color, and they were definitely more inclusive, open spaces for a lot of artists to come together and meet and cross-pollinate and learn. And so I think within the art world or the photography world, there's definitely opportunities for community and community building that exists and have existed for a long time. I think what's kind of different and interesting about digital space is that, of course, that can happen at a much faster rate, and you can have more global perspectives altogether. And that's something I loved about photoblogging when I got into it back in 2005. And that's something that obviously people love about social media when it exploded shortly after. And the Web3 space is one that really kind of promotes collective building and collective opportunity and collective ideas. And purely because it's based on this ecosystem of decentralized blockchain, I think there's kind of that ethos at mind that there can be different ways of doing things together. And so I think that's really where it's different. But in terms of community building and kind of fostering spaces that feel inclusive and open and encouraging of dialogue and learning and engagement and inspiration, I think that's something that has existed since art has existed. There's just varying degrees of spaces that feel that way or are positive. And I've been lucky to be involved in some of those spaces that are great examples of physical meeting places in the world for artists working in photography. And so with this Assembly, we saw early on last year that actually Justin had his Twin Flames Discord server that was devoted to his project and his work. And a lot of artists were kind of creating their own Discord servers to try and build an audience and a community around their work and practice. And we saw right then that, there's really, I think, an opportunity to create one kind of more open space that is focused on art photography, but it's kind of wide open for artists to come together, and we can have artist channels. And, we started with these kind of open studio channels where artists could have spaces. And then as Assembly continued to develop the curated drops, they were the first curated art photography drops in the NFT space. And it was the first Discord community for folks to kind of come together and talk and exchange. So we knew that there was value in building something like that because, especially for artists, I think there's already, and I'm an artist that experiences this myself, there's already so much pressure on promoting yourself or, maintaining your website or sending a newsletter or whatever it is that's involved in kind of the networking and promotion and audience building of your work, that sometimes you run out of time to just be an artist and do what you do best. And whether it is with Lightwork or with Assembly, I think there's a really similar mission there. Is how can we support artists in ways that allows them more and more to do what they do best, which is make work.
Right.
And yet, how can we also still cultivate a space that feels open? When it comes to curating, it does provide context and education and fosters a deeper understanding of artists' work and practice, and then ultimately cares for their work. When you're involved in something like that, you're ultimately a custodian, and the work is kind of in your hands. So you have to, make sure that you're being a good steward of the artist and their work and their vision. And that's something that I've enjoyed doing in all those other roles. And I think is an important way that Assembly operates beyond just creating an inclusive space and really trying to bring some of the best and most interesting and important art photography to the blockchain. And whether it's an emerging artist or a mid-career artist or an iconic artist.
Yeah, if we take a look back over your practice and your career, you've made photographs in fine art contexts, resulting in books and prints and gallery settings. You've worked in editorial contexts, making images for publications like the New York Times and Bloomberg. And you've also worked with hundreds of photo-based artists at Lightwork, and as well as your previous publishing company. And I'm wondering, what do you think is the value of NFTs? What do they bring to photography? What do they make possible for artists?
Wow. Well, so many things. I mean, I think there is value in kind of fostering these connections. It's, for me, what's actually really exciting about NFTs is how it's changed collecting. So much of how collecting operates within the traditional art world or art market is kind of behind closed doors. And, if you're lucky enough to be in a collector's home, to walk around and kind of see and experience a really thoughtfully built collection, then you have the opportunity, but oftentimes you don't, or you won't, or there's an aspect of collecting and ownership that's a little bit exclusive.
Right.
So I think what's great about this space is it's actually the opposite, and that even just the process of collecting is kind of public and transparent. And I think there's something, it is creative, that act of collecting. It's a creative act. It can be a political act. Like there's the gesture of who you're supporting as a collector and how you're building a collection can impact artists in the community in really, really significant ways. And so it's nice to see how that can operate in a space that is more public and more transparent, wherein collectors can learn from each other and artists can learn from and see collections. And that to me is like really, really new. And then, we touched on the royalties, which of course is, I think, an exciting thing where artists over a long period of time might make in royalties for your work trading hands eventually can be more significant than primary sales of your work. And, I think the artist-collector relationship is also really important. Maybe not every artist is interested in it or every collector is interested in it, but where it happens, I think it's really kind of meaningful and amazing. It's not that it doesn't exist within the traditional art world or art market. I've met collectors of my work or been able to have that opportunity, but it just doesn't happen as much or as easily. It's not kind of as much part of the culture always. And you have to get those sort of occasional opportunities to do so. Whereas here, I think it's like, it's a part of that community aspect. There's that desire to connect, even if it's just a little bit, and been able to, whether it was, talking with Blackbird or, other collectors, kind of understand, oh, this is why I'm drawn to this piece, or this is what this piece means to me. And unless that's relayed to you or you have a lucky enough experience to have that opportunity, it just doesn't seem to happen quite as much. So that's one thing that I've, really loved as an artist myself, is just having that connection point and having that ability to kind of converse around the work with someone who is supporting me and my practice and is engaging with the work, or, in the case of some of the Assembly artists, or, even artists that are not a part of Assembly's curated drops. In some of the kind of advising I do or talking with folks, I'm not limited to just the projects that we've maybe had kind of a hand in. Like I really truly want to see collectors find and discover and build collections of work that's going to be really important and meaningful to them. But that's been great, just having direct conversations about the work and why it's interesting and why it's moving and why it's meaningful, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the collectors in the NFT space are actually anon and will go by pseudonyms, like Blackbird, like you just mentioned. And it's funny how, despite this, it seems like they are more accessible as collectors, and that these types of relationships between collectors and artists are actually maybe easier despite this anonymity. I've sold work to private collectors and, corporate collections and things like that. And I have met collectors, but it does feel a little bit shadowy and distant sometimes. You don't necessarily meet them. And sometimes these are just deals that happen through a gallery or some other intermediary, and you don't necessarily know exactly, who is collecting the work. And it's just interesting that even in this space with all of the anonymity and, people with toads as their profile pic, there is still this ability to really get to know collectors and to build these relationships. After being in this space for almost, I guess you've been thinking about crypto since around 2017, but I feel like you've been in the NFT space like really actively for about 2 years. Is that right?
A little less, probably. Really got into it, I guess, around January of last year.
Okay, so a year and a half. What is your vision for the future of NFT photography? Do you see certain trends developing or interesting pathways forward? Sort of what's next?
Wow. if we had a crystal ball, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm mostly just excited for the technology to improve and become more and more frictionless. I think it will support more adoption and use cases. And it's already been exciting just over the course of the last year and a half to see the kinds of innovation and possibilities that exist when kind of building on top of this ecosystem or thinking about a new form of crowdfunding to make things possible, or as we talked about, all the kind of new ways that you can make interesting connections or the conceptual gestures that can happen with work in the space, and some interesting projects that I've seen at, say, the intersection of photography and generative art. But really, I'm just excited to see how the technology can move in a way that gets easier and easier and easier so that we can have more people utilize it in ways that are meaningful, and it just becomes more and more frictionless. I think the space will kind of mature and evolve in some interesting ways that maybe we can't predict, but as you said, kind of having one foot in the traditional art world and one foot in Web3, I think there is this opportunity to kind of pick some of the things that we do love and appreciate from this art world that has existed for a long time, and kind of reject and let go of some of the things we don't like about it, and then fill in the gaps and change some things in terms of how everything operates within Web3. So this plane that's being built is still in its infancy. And so I'm just excited to see what innovations and creations people bring to the table as we go forward. And I'm excited to be a part of that. I have some interesting ideas for my own work. I have some projects I haven't started yet that could kind of emerge from this space as a starting point, which is just totally new, right? As opposed to some of the projects that I've introduced from the other direction. And I'm excited for, assembly too, because I think that there's room for all of these communities and platforms within the art world or the photography world, I think. But people will find, kind of the community that they align with, and, just like a record label or a publishing house or something like that. If they were to have kind of a space where you could spend time and interact and connect with people, you kind of find your people. So I'm just excited to see what other connections that I can make. I feel like reflecting upon the last year or year and a half, so much has happened. And within a relatively short period of time, I've met a lot of new people and had a lot of meaningful connections and friendships, and then opportunities, of course, emerge out of that, whether they're kind of personal or professional. Mm-hmm. So I'm just excited. I don't have that crystal ball, but I'm eagerly watching and waiting.
Can you tell us about any new photo projects? Can you give us the Shane Lavalette alpha?
Of what I'm working on?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't know if I'm ready to talk about that quite yet. But I guess I'll say that I have a couple past projects that I haven't done anything with that I'm kind of thinking about what exactly to do with the work. There's a number of projects that have been unresolved and kind of finally finding some time to move through that. Mm-hmm. And then I have a big project that's kind of it's a crazy idea. Maybe this is just another conversation for another time, but I'm thinking about how this space could actually be a part of launching it and making it possible. And the conversation around utility and NFTs is kind of a big, complicated topic. And I'm sort of the persuasion that, for artists, the art is the utility, right? And anything on top of that is kind of a cherry on top. Mm-hmm. But I'm also really interested in thinking about how the technology can foster some of these connections and kind of create a support system that can actually make a project possible in ways that it can be possible. And I've been lucky enough to experience that with, say, a museum like the High Museum that in part, invested in the work before it existed, and then it made the creation of the work possible. And so I think that's an exciting territory and something that I'm thinking about for my own practice. And then with the technology itself, it would be a bit of a departure for me to create a project that is maybe more connected to the technology, because so much of my work is like kind of out in the world and about place. But I have some interesting ideas that if they don't feel right, then maybe they'll actually emerge under a pseudonym. So so you can see the project and you might not know it's me, but I think that would be fun.
And where can listeners follow you and Assembly on social?
Well, I'm just at Shane Lavalette on social, and Assembly is at Assembly Projects on some social, like Instagram. But if you're on Twitter, it's at Assembly Curated.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today, Shane. Thank you so much for your time. We really enjoyed this little conversation. And yeah, hopefully we can catch up again in the future, maybe when this mystery big project drops, whenever that might be. But thank you again. And it's been a pleasure chatting.
I'll keep you posted. Well, the pleasure was mine. It was great to talk with you both. And yeah, I'm happy you're doing this series. I'll look forward to listening to everybody else, not myself. I won't listen to myself, but I'll listen to everybody else.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Raw Review. You can find us online at rawdao.xyz and on Twitter at @TheRawDAO. Join the conversation at discord.gg/rawdao.
The Raw Review podcast is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Views expressed by guests and the hosts do not reflect the views of RAW DAO. The Raw Review podcast is not investment advice or a solicitation to make any financial decisions.
NFTs and cryptocurrencies discussed in this episode are not endorsed by RAW DAO. Do not purchase raw tokens, other cryptocurrencies, or NFTs in anticipation of financial returns. Please do your own research.